So we're going to talk about Easter slightly unconventionally by starting with Buddha. Now I'm very fond of pointing out that Buddha didn't have Jesus to learn from. He was 500 years before. And yet he was a great spiritual teacher too, and no doubt the Holy Spirit existed before Jesus came to earth, right? And so Buddha is a master teacher, and he says some things that could just help clarify understanding of Christianity and indeed Easter, what the crucifixion is and what the resurrection is. So I'm going to start with the end, Buddha's last words, which were, strive for your own liberation with diligence. Now in Romans 8:28, it says all things work together for good for those who love God. Okay? So we're going to talk about a bunch of different concepts, some Buddha, some math, just some general ideas that work together for those who love God. Now some Buddhists have gotten a little sensitive when I mention the word God. In the Bible it says that God is love. And so really that sentence could be, all things work together for good for those who love love. Right? I think that pretty much includes everybody. So that's how I want you thinking. Okay? When I say the word God, it is the idea of big time love. Now that again incorporates everybody. That's a big part of this too, is to recognize that's the direction we're headed, and that's what Easter is actually ultimately all about. So all things work together, and I'm going to include some fun stuff, try to pull it all together. In Colossians 1:27, Apostle Paul teaches that there's a mystery, and the mystery is that Christ is in you. Okay? That's a mystery. What does a mystery imply? Something's going on that we don't quite understand, right? There's some sort of question that we don't know the answer to. It's some sort of puzzle or some sort of riddle. And the mystery, Paul says, is that Christ is in you. Well, how does this occur? How do we get to that discovery of the Christ within? I'm going to use some basic math. And just think about it from the mathematical point of view and what it's like to be a math student learning basic math and then moving our way up. So I have three simple equations, an easy equation, a more difficult problem in math, and then a significantly more difficult one, okay, coming from calculus. So if I ask you an easy math question, 1 plus 1, I'd like to think you'd all know the answer. Come on, someone.
2.
There you go, okay? But if I asked that of a 1-year-old, would they be able to answer it? Most not. So is it easy to the 1-year-old? No, they haven't learned it yet. But when they're given that question some point, maybe kindergarten, right? They have to answer that question. And when they do, how do they feel? They feel good. Okay, they got the right answer. Now, a more moderate question is the square root of 49. Now, the first grader usually doesn't know that. Do you guys know square root of 49?
7.
Okay. What number has a number when multiplied by itself produces that number? Okay. So 7 times 7 is 49. That's a little bit harder question. The first grader has to answer that question. And then maybe, I don't know, the fourth grader has to answer that question. A little bit more difficult, more moderate. Calculus becomes even more difficult. What's the integral of 2x? Very good. What's the derivative of x squared? It's good because I didn't want you to get the answer. The integral of 2x is x squared, and the derivative of x squared is 2x. That's calculus. It's also the only calculus I know. Could a first grader get that? Absolutely not. The first grader has to get 1 plus 1 equals 2. The fourth grader has to get the square root of 49, and then the 12th grader has to work on the calculus equations, right? Now, this person's only going to be satisfied if they get the answer to their question. They don't need to be figuring out the calculus. That's not the level that they're at. Different levels, different problems, different equations, okay? Different levels of difficulty. And so each individual person in this world has a math problem to figure out. Each one of us has a life that has a bunch of complexities to it. Some people's lives might seem easier, some people's lives might seem more difficult. But your job is to figure out your equation, your difficulties, your complexities, and not worry about the other guys. Strive for your own liberation with diligence. The Buddha could have said, figure out your own math problem. If you're given 1 plus 1, answer that. If you're given the square root of 49, answer that. And if you didn't know the answer to the integral of 2x, I'm sure you could have looked it up and figured it out, right? And then when you get that, how do you feel? The answer to the mystery has been revealed to you. You now know that the integral of 2x is x squared. And then you feel good about that, right? That's your own liberation, is figuring out your equation. Jesus, John 7:24, addresses this directly. Judge not by mere appearances, judge correctly. Very specifically, he's saying, guess what? All of us have to figure ourselves out. It's the same thing as your own liberation. You got to liberate yourself relative to your circumstances. I have to do it relative to mine. My circumstances might seem easier or difficult to you. But that'd be like the 12th grader complaining, why does that first grader get to answer 1 plus 1? That's easy. Why wasn't I given an easy question like that? Well, you probably were about 11 years earlier. At some phase in your development, you got 1 plus 1 and you mastered it. So then you got to move on to square roots, and then you got to move on to more difficult things like calculus. This is the essence and the spirit of Luke 2:52. Jesus grew in stature and in favor with God. Jesus grew in stature and favor with God? I thought he was perfect. No, he had a process that was unfolding for him. He had to learn too. He had to understand what it was to be human and figure that out too. And they had to work his way up to understanding the crucifixion and what he needed to go through. This wasn't easy for him. It was difficult. It was this PhD level math question to get crucified and love his enemies while doing so. That's pretty high level stuff. And yet it was a process. He was learning as a teenager, studying in the temple. And it wasn't just all handed to him. He had to figure it out. He knew what he needed to do, and he had to strive for his own liberation. And find the Christ within. That's the whole point. That's the mystery. And that's the thing he taught us. The Christ is in us too. You are the light of the world too. And the Buddha said, you are Buddha too. These things go hand in hand. And so John 7:24, judge not by mere appearances. Don't look at somebody else's life and assume that it's difficult or hard and it's good or bad because of that. Look at all the adversity that person went through. I feel so bad for them. Or, boy, that person has it easy because they got millions of dollars or whatever. Each one of us has our own complexities, and we have to figure out our own equation as a result. That's your liberation. It's why Jesus says, don't worry about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own. You can't figure out your equation, and you're looking at this guy, mocking him for not figuring out his equation. If you try to help someone else understand their equation, and you don't even understand yours, it's a little bit more difficult to do. So we have to strive for our own liberation and figure out our own circumstances, which is why I'm not judging you by mere appearance. You might be way ahead of me in development, even though your life looks much messier. I would suggest at the very end, Jesus' life looked the messiest. While he was being crucified, what a mess that appeared to be. If you came upon the scene and you saw a man being tortured and murdered, you'd think, boy, I'd hate to be that guy. Would he want you to think that? Of course not. He knew what was happening. He was trying to show us something. He was mastering his circumstances. And he was telling us, no matter what you go through, you can also respond like this. This is how you find the Christ within. By detaching from the difficulty of the test you're going through. And by connecting to that Christ and that light within. There's a reason why you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. By realizing you are given that strength, that you were born with it. It's the inner Buddha. It's the inner Christ. It's something that we all have. And that's why it's a mystery, because we don't realize it's in us and that we're carrying it around with us. We don't know this. So what is the crucifixion? The crucifixion is the process that we all go through figuring out our own life circumstances. Detaching from the idea of the false self, the physical self, or the ego self, and attaching to the Christ within. That process is a crucifixion. You know what you have to do that? You have to love your enemy. You have to forgive others. You have to be merciful and kind and compassionate. You know all the virtues. You know what you don't have to do? Demand apologies. Sit around demanding respect from others. You don't have to do that. This is how you get liberated. Remember, this is for spiritual people. That's who I'm talking to. This is why politics and spirituality don't mix so well. The fact is, I don't need your respect. I can find the Christ within no matter what, and you can do the same. All of us have that ability, and yet getting to that point where I don't demand you respect me is a crucifixion. Because you have a voice inside your head, known as the ego. It's also the devil. Swap the word devil out or Satan for ego in the Bible, it'll make a whole lot of sense. You have a voice inside your head that's crying, this isn't fair. I don't like this. I wish this didn't happen to me. Well, you got to do some digging to find that Christ. It's hidden inside of you, remember? That's the mystery. You do some digging by forgiving and by being patient and trusting and being hopeful in difficult circumstances. See, the calculus student knows there's an answer to this. And it would be silly to throw your pencil down saying, this is unfair, why are they giving me these difficult equations? I already figured out the square root of 49, why do I need something more difficult? Well, you haven't quite mastered it yet. Our challenges come in the form of the difficulties we experience. Sometimes physical, sometimes emotional. But we're going to experience them. This is why Luke 12:47 is a thing. When you know your master's will, and you don't make ready according to his will, you will receive a severe beating. See, if it's time for you to learn calculus and you're stumbling over 1 + 1 = 2, you're going to get a severe beating. You're going to look pretty stupid to the math teacher. You're like, you forgot 1 + 1? You don't remember square roots anymore? Come on, we're on to calculus already. If you're at a phase in your development where you know you're supposed to be loving your enemy and you're not, and what you're supposed to be doing is becoming a peacemaker and building bridges with each other, and yet you're still insisting that your point of view is correct and someone else's is wrong, if that's the phase of your development and you want to call yourself spiritual, you're going to get a severe beating. You're probably going to get in a lot of arguments too. A lot of people are going to get mad at you, and it's going to bug you. But the master recognizes, I have to be a peacemaker. And I go through this process of my own development, like Luke 2:52, in which I know I need to experience these things. And it accepts and embraces. It's why Paul and Jesus both compare this process to childbirth. Why do women have babies again? I hear it's very difficult. They do it because it's worth it. They want the baby at the end. Why do we go through difficulty? Why is life so difficult? Because at the end, we give birth to Christ. It's the crucifixion resurrection aspect. The true self wakes back up again. The word Buddha means to awaken. To awaken to what? The man's name was Siddhartha. He became known as the Buddha because he awakened to the truth of reality. Well, that's the crucifixion and the resurrection. All of us are doing that too. When you awaken to the born-again self, the divine self, the Christ within self, that's the resurrection. See, if you know your master's will and you don't make ready according to his will, you receive a severe beating. But what happens if you do the master's will? Well, it's like getting the answer to these questions. You feel good. It's why in 1 Peter 5:10, it tells us that after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. You will suffer. It happens to be the first noble truth of Buddhism. You're going to suffer. You're here. It's a process. It's a painful process. But after you've suffered for a little while, guess what? You're called to the eternal glory of Christ, which is found where? Inside you. See, if we don't have the struggles and the suffering, if we don't have the difficulties in life, if we don't get challenged with more and more complex equations, we don't find the Christ within. That process we call a crucifixion. Finding the answer to that process, which is revealing the Christ within, is what we call a resurrection. This is everybody on earth, 7 billion of us, all going through difficulties and challenges and sufferings. All prophets teach something very similar to strive for your own liberation with diligence. What we're supposed to do is embrace our own personal crucifixion. You don't have to add anything to it. It's going to happen anyways. Whatever you've been experiencing is your equation. Embrace it. As he says in Revolver, my favorite movie, embrace the pain and you'll win the game, right? Embrace your crucifixion. Understand that the resurrection is right around the corner. As Peter says, after you've suffered for a little while, then you're going to be restored and confirmed. Because once you find the Christ within, that's your resurrection. That's the process, and that's a guarantee. Going to happen to everybody. Happy Easter.